Welcome to Stacy on the Ride here on Family Vision Media. You can find out more at familyvisionmedia.org. And I'm so excited to have with me today Robert P. George. He's the professor of jurisprudence and director of the James Madison program in American Ideals and Institutions at Princeton University. Thank you, sir, for joining me this afternoon.
It's my pleasure, Stacy. Thank you.
So let's talk about this. We've seen a lot of stories, mainly in right-leaning publications, about the cancellation of professors and others who teach at our higher education institutions. And often it's for viewpoint discrimination, where they simply hold a viewpoint that is more traditional or is no longer mainstream. And when they express that or try to exert some kind of control over their classroom, they're usually vilified by the students and then subjected to some form of cancellation. And in this instance, it's Joshua Katz, who our viewers might not know much about him. So tell us more about this, but what's happening here?
Joshua Katz was, until his dismissal recently, the Kotzen professor of classics at Princeton University. He's a very distinguished classical linguist. He's a specialist on ancient languages, not just Greek and Latin, but many other ancient languages from different cultures, East and West. He had been a professor for something like 23 years at Princeton when he was dismissed. And he was dismissed in a very complicated case. I can speak to it, but I can't say everything I know. And the reason I can't say everything I know is that I served as Joshua's official advisor in the university's disciplinary system throughout the 4-year process that eventually concluded with his dismissal from the university and the revocation of his tenure. But I'll tell you what I can tell you. The case began with an offense, a wrong that Joshua committed and admits to having committed, that occurred many years ago, back in 2005, 2006, when he was still a pretty young professor. He had an affair with a student, a female student who was under his supervision. That affair was short-lived. It didn't last very long. The student graduated. She went on with her life to become a lawyer and to be married. He went on with his life. Then something like 11 years later, more than a decade later, a third party, not the former student, a third party reported that this affair had happened back in whenever it was, 2006. And the university said, well, that's a very serious offense. We have to look into it. They got in touch with both Professor Katz and with the woman, now a lawyer, with whom he had had the illicit relationship. And she did not want to have anything to do with the case. She did not want it to go forward. She did not want an investigation. She had no accusations against Professor Katz of any sort of wrongdoing or anything like that. Professor Katz immediately admitted to the offense, said that he had done it, that it had troubled his conscience all these years. In the meantime, he had grown older. He had undergone a religious conversion. He was a very different person. But nevertheless, the university went forward with the investigation, with his full cooperation, with his admission of the offense back in 2005, 2006, whenever it was. And there was a resolution, and he was suspended from teaching without pay for a year. So he was placed on what's called administrative leave, suspended, no pay, for a year. And he was also required to get counseling, which went on for almost 4 years. At that point, the matter should have been concluded. It was over. However, after that happened, he became a controversial figure on campus. Although he was not a conservative, he criticized some recommendations or demands, I guess they were called, that were made by some of our faculty on the progressive or woke side, on the left, in the wake of the George Floyd shooting, or not shooting, but killing.
Right.
And when he criticized some of their demands, for example, for a committee that would investigate professors for, quote, racist research, and that there be special privileges and payments and compensations for faculty of color that would not apply to people who didn't count as faculty of color, I guess white faculty members. He criticized that, and he became very controversial as a result of that. As I say, despite not being a political person, not being a conservative person, I did not know him at all. Well, we were mere acquaintances. I only had gotten to know him as a friend when I started representing him, when he reached out to me to be his advisor in the university disciplinary process, in 2000, I guess 2017. But, by the time he became controversial, we had become friends. Some of his comments elicited criticism from the president of the university, but the president of the university, whose name is Christopher Eisgruber, and has always been a strong proponent of free speech. The president, while criticizing Professor Katz, concluded that Professor Katz could not be punished for his statements or words because they were protected by Princeton's very strong free speech principles. We have the University of Chicago's free speech principles, which are the best. They're the very strong free speech principles. And so that should have been the end of that. However, there were woke elements on campus who were very upset, both with President Eisgruber and with Professor Katz. And so they began digging dirt, trying to find something against him. They noticed that he had had an off-cycle leave that hadn't been explained. They discovered the affair from, at this point, nearly a decade and a half earlier that had taken place. They demanded more information about it. All sorts of rumors and accusations were made. The university's initial decision was not to comment on it, but then later the university decided that some comment needed to be made either by Professor Katz or by the university. So they gave Professor Katz what essentially boiled down to an ultimatum: either you tell the story or we tell the story. So he decided that he would tell the story. The university had hoped and thought that it would quiet the waters, that once the facts were out there, that would be that. It didn't. It inflamed the situation. This eventually led to the woman who had originally refused to cooperate with the process and didn't want anything to do with it and didn't want to go forward, now coming forward with accusations. And so now we had a second round of investigations, which culminated in his being fired. Now, but for the controversy about his speech, none of this would be happening. But that is not to say that the university is punishing him here for his speech. The university is punishing him here for offenses connected to the affair, although I had argued and continue to believe that the second investigation should never have taken place because it's a violation of the due process principle of double jeopardy. So it's a complicated matter. And then on top of all that, Stacy, back in September of 2019, Professor Katz was smeared in a video and website that were mandatorily used in the freshman orientation. All freshmen were a captive audience for this video and website that accused him falsely of being a racist and even doctored a quotation of his in order to make him out to be racist. He's the farthest thing from a racist you could possibly have, Joshua Katz. But nevertheless, they smeared him, which now led to demands for an investigation of who in the university's bureaucracy, who in the administration, which bureaucrats were responsible for the smear. And that is still pending. So although Professor Katz has been fired, I'm pushing the question, others are putting the question, okay, who was responsible for this defamation and what is going to be done in the disciplinary system to them as a result of what they did? Because there's no doubt they smeared him, Stacy, because of his speech. He was defamed as a punishment, as retaliation, as harassment for his free speech.
And we're talking about comments that he made about the fairness of giving professors at the University of Color who may or may not have experienced racism. We don't know, but they weren't actually under allegations. They had not raised allegations against Princeton that they've been discriminated against. They weren't in disputes with the EEOC about their pay or their benefits. They simply were university employees of color who would then receive some kind of compensation because of what happened to George Floyd, who is unrelated to Princeton University or any of the faculty there.
And that would be unfair and probably a violation of federal and possibly state civil rights laws to do that. And the university didn't do that, and the university is not going to do that. But those were the demands he criticized. But they were demanding something even worse than that. And that was a committee, a standing committee of professors who would investigate other professors for alleged racist research, where the committee defines what counts as racist. Well, you can imagine the abuses of academic freedom that would take place with that. I mean, that's like having an inquisition back. It's outrageous. And Katz had the temerity to say, it's outrageous.
So I'm trying to, because I thought surely there was some element of conservative viewpoint that was being crushed here. But we're talking about a very left-leaning professor who, up until the point of the discovery of his affair, which, so we're also on that part of the story. So I have to say, on that part of the story, I really find it to be shocking, because we're talking about a consensual relationship in which the woman initially didn't even want to have anything to do with an investigation. So she hadn't found anything wrong with their relationship. It had ended, and she'd moved on amicably and not raised any concerns to the university about her treatment as a student or her subsequent degree that she earned. She just simply moved on with her life, but he was still punished, and in a very severe way. A year without pay. I mean, he might as well have sexually harassed someone. He might as well have, attacked someone for that kind of treatment. That kind of punishment is very severe. But then to later have it used against him again, which, as you mentioned, in America, you're not tried for the same crime twice. You're not punished for it twice. If you're found innocent the first go around, even if you're guilty, you're off the hook because double jeopardy attaches. So it is kind of odd behavior. And then the worst of it is that the people seeking to do all of this are not only crushing his free speech, but they've ruined his livelihood and set an example for anyone else who might speak out in the future about this kind of idea that we need a board or some kind of unelected, unaccountable group of people sitting around determining what is and isn't racism, on behalf of everyone at the school. It disenfranchising the voices of potentially thousands of people. So it's just crazy that this is happening, and at Princeton, of all places.
Yeah, Stacy, let me add a few nuances to what you've said. First, Professor Katz was never far left. He was a kind of mainstream liberal Democrat, not of the Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez sort of variety, but maybe of the sort of Barack Obama 2008 or so variety.
Well, that's a good distinction to make, because most of us, we do understand there's a difference between those different viewpoints.
Yeah.
Like that is important.
Now, I mean, I think what's happened to Professor Katz, like a lot of people in the old school liberal movement, is that the Democratic Party and the liberal movement have moved leftward much farther than they think is sane. So I would not style him as far left, but moderate liberal. Okay. I think these days he's become a good deal more conservative, which I approve of because I'm a conservative, but he was never really on the far left. Number two, the conduct back in 2006, I think it was, 2005, 2006, 2006, 2007, it was definitely wrong, and it was in violation of the university's rules. There was a clear rule against having a romantic or sexual relationship with a student under your supervision. He never contested, I as his advisor, never contested that was a valid rule and that it had been broken. Okay. He felt guilty about it all those 10 years, especially as he himself, as I say, had a religious conversion. And he began to see what he had done, not just as a violation of a rule. He came to see it as a sin. Okay. So that's number two. And then number three, I've lost my train of thought. I'm afraid there was a third thing that I wanted to add, just a little bit of a nuance on Stacy.
I mentioned the fact that his punishment was so severe because it was a year's worth of suspension with no pay, and then it was him again.
Yeah. So I want people to understand my double jeopardy argument. And here there's some complications, and it's too complex to go into right here. But let me tell you why the fact finders rejected my double jeopardy argument. I think they were wrong to do that. I believe in my argument, but it wasn't crazy. Let me give you their point of view. There was a new allegation that had never been made, that hadn't been adjudicated. And that was the allegation that while they were having their relationship, he had discouraged her from receiving mental health care she needed because he was afraid that if she went to see a psychiatrist, that would expose their affair and get him into trouble. So that was a specific new thing. And so the fact finders and the deans and the presidents and the board's theory is, well, it's not double jeopardy because we never adjudicated that offense. But my argument state, and that's not crazy, that's a reasonable position. Yeah. But I think the better position, the one I advocated for but didn't carry the day on, is, well, look, she had the chance in 2017 when we first adjudicated all these things to come forward with any evidence she had growing out of that nexus of facts surrounding the affair. She held back. If she had this allegation, now I actually don't believe the allegation. That's itself a complicated story, but lay that aside. If she had this allegation, she had a chance to make it. She was invited to make it. She was encouraged to make it, and she didn't make it. And you can't allow somebody to just hold a sort of Damocles over somebody else's head like that. That to me is double jeopardy. So that's the complication.
So I think the worst thing in the world would be to go through what he went through and the year-long suspension, and then to have everything resurrected again because he made a
Yes.
statement about what he felt to be something improper. So he was simply expressing his opinion on the proposed new things coming out of the George Floyd killing. And he probably hadn't even thought to himself, I should be quiet about this because what if they look into my history? He thought, I've already been punished. I've already accepted responsibility, and that's behind me. And the issue before him at the time had nothing to do with the subject matter of his, the thing that had been his trip up. It wasn't a sexual issue. That wasn't like he was commenting on Me Too or the movement or any of that. It was something to do with the treatment of people on the staff there, the faculty. So I think there's a valid question to be raised as to whether or not it's safe on Princeton's campus to disagree with whatever the suggested new orthodoxy is. If some new orthodoxy presents itself on the campus and you're a professor, you're kind of taking your career in your own hands and jeopardizing it if you disagree with what's being proposed or what's being suggested. And the more extreme the suggestion, the more likely it is that the backlash will completely wreck your life going into areas that have nothing to do with it, because the previously adjudicated claim against him that he acknowledged and took responsibility for and was punished for is not in the same vein. Like, it's not topically or policy wise in the same area. That is the part to me that is kind of, it's like, basically, we're going to smear you with anything we can find in your past, even if it has nothing to do with. So if he previously had an allegation against him of racial animus, and then people tried to use that to say, well, the reason why he opposes these new boards or these new suggestions coming from George Floyd is because he had this in his background. He has had allegations of racial animus leveled against him in the past. Then you could see them bringing that up and saying it has some bearing on this. This is his past behavior. This is a part of that. Even if it's invalid, you could tangentially draw a link between those two and see why people would say his history says this. But these two things are unrelated. There is no Me Too aspect to the George Floyd killing or any of the things used to remediate it. So it's a really weird, it's like a devil may care, like anything you've ever done, we're going to use against you.
That's exactly right, Stacey. Now, this has never been a Me Too situation. He's not accused of that. It has never been a Title IX situation. The university did not find a Title IX offense, a sexual harassment or coercion or anything like that offense. But beyond that, the point you just made is so important. It's what makes it really bad, I think, that this second investigation and this punishment have gone forward. And that is this. Anybody now at my university, other universities, who has anything in their past, and most people have something in their past. It might not be a sex offense, sexual offense, but people, none of us are perfect, right?
Right.
You're going to worry if I question some dogma of the woke or of the progressives or the left, they'll start digging the dirt on me the way they did with Joshua Katz, and they'll find whatever the past offense is, big or small, and they'll try to ruin my life, ruin my career, get me fired. The great 19th century theorist of free speech, John Stuart Mill, made a really important point that we would do well to remember. He said, look, rules protecting free speech, like laws protecting free speech, are very important. We need them. We need the formal rules. They really matter, but they're not enough. They're necessary, but not sufficient. What you need in addition to the formal legal protections of free speech is a culture of free speech, a culture that values free speech, a culture in which people feel as though they can speak their minds and engage in robust debate so that we can live as a democratic people. We can live as good citizens together, being able to challenge each other and be challenged. You need that for truth seeking. You need that for democracy. Mill was absolutely right about that point. And what we have in the Katz case is an example of grave harm being done to the culture of free speech, to that second condition, in addition to the formal legal protections, the rules that needs to be in place if free speech is to be real, not just parchment guarantees.
So I think that quote is so apt and so wonderful for us to focus on. But in my mind, when I'm listening to you, Professor, I feel like the kind of people who can uphold that value beyond it being a constitutional right are tougher than we are today. The simple disagreement with global warming and I shouldn't say global warming because the planet does heat, it warms, it cools. Anthropologically,
Well, just any dogma,
right,
anything
any dogma,
on the left, whether it turns out that it's right or it's wrong.
right,
The point is, you
so
get these
sensitive.
orthodoxies created,
Yeah.
and orthodoxies have a place in religion, and I'm religious myself, and I don't mind dogmas of religion, which we can freely subscribe to or not. I can decide whether I'm going to be Muslim or Jewish or Catholic or Protestant or what have you. But in intellectual life, certainly in non-sectarian universities like Princeton, we cannot pursue truth. We cannot do our jobs. We cannot teach our students if we are bound by dogmas. Dogma is the enemy of truth in the context of higher education. And that's what we have today, dogmas impeding the pursuit of truth.
And so, how do we get back there? Because I feel like it starts at home with children being taught that people will disagree with you, that you will not always prevail in an argument or a discussion, that it's okay to, after you've presented your
Yep.
case and you've argued your very best, to say, well, let's agree to disagree, or thank you for the discussion, walking away having made no, even though you might have scored points on the facts or the history, you haven't really gotten anywhere with the person, you haven't changed their mind. We have not, as a society, taught today's adults, so I'm talking about the grown ones who have mortgages and cars and stuff, they do not have the ability to simply hear an opposing viewpoint and then walk away and go, that was nonsense, or that was interesting, or wow, there were some interesting points made there. If it's in disagreement with their ideological viewpoint, the person must be destroyed. Just the presence of disagreement, it is a impetus for war making on that person. How do we get back to a normal place from that insanity?
Well, what you put your finger on is exactly what the problem is. Let me now add an additional dimension to it. A grave threat to free speech, to viewpoint diversity, to the truth-seeking enterprise that depends on free speech and viewpoint diversity is identity politics. Identitarianism as an ideology, tribalism as it's sometimes called, that is toxic. It's toxic to the learning environment. It's toxic to education. It's toxic to knowledge seeking. And for this reason, Stacey, we need to be able to question each other's beliefs, question each other's positions, question each other's convictions without taking it personally. The trouble with identitarianism, whether it's race, sexual orientation, gender, any of that stuff, is that once that is the background assumption, once we're in the identitarian universe, then my disagreeing with you is not just a disagreement about what the truth of a matter is between the two of us. It is and will be perceived by you as an attack on you. If I challenge your beliefs, I'm attacking you. But my goodness, we can't have that. There's no way truth seeking can go forward if we allow ourselves to treat challenges to our intellectual positions as personal attacks. But in the tribal environment and mentality of identity politics, that's exactly what we have. So I think we have to crush identity politics. I want it rooted out, root and branch. Just take it out. Enough with the identity politics. Let's deal with each other as individuals. Let's take each other as people possessing human dignity, whether we're right or wrong. Let's interact with each other in a way that is robust but respectful. But let's not take challenges to our perspectives or viewpoints as personal assaults.
Yeah. And so just at that, just being able to acknowledge that So we disagree on this point, but we still both hold value as people,
Hmm.
and our ideas are valid. And then, we live to kind of joust another day. Just that would bring so much more calm back to our current discussions, back to the intercourse that goes on between left and right. And also, now it's parents against, public schools, or there's so many different factions that have formed, and all of the people involved claim that they're here for the best interest of, children, or the truth, or the environment, or what have you. But the way that we're going back and forth with each other, and the way that there's this attempt to, it's not just, I don't want to hear what you have to say, I don't want anyone to hear what you have to say, I also don't want you to have a job, I also don't want you to be able to, like, pay your bills, I want you to be in Argentina someplace completely canceled, working in a, fruit stand. And even if I find out about that, I'm going to try to cancel you from the fruit stand. Like, that is, it's a crazy. I just, unbelievable.
On the other side, let me tell you that some of the greatest blessings, some of the greatest experiences I have had in my 35, now 36 years of teaching at Princeton have been the seminars that I do together with Cornel West, who is somebody who couldn't be farther from me politically. I'm an old school conservative. Cornel is honorary chairman of the Democratic Socialists of America. Yet we teach together, we work together, we travel doing programs together, because despite our differences about politics, we are both dedicated to the life of the mind. We are dedicated to the pursuit of truth. And we both realize that to challenge each other is not to attack each other. Quite the opposite. We're bound together by the bond of truth seeking. We respect each other and we try to learn from each other, and not just to teach each other. And I'll tell you, it's a beautiful thing. More learning has gone on for our students in our classrooms together than either of us can produce on his own in a lecture hall or in a seminar. It's just a wonderful, beautiful thing. And it's the practical evidence that the best thing we can do for the educational process is be open to engagement with other people who dramatically disagree with us.
Yeah. And to learn from that, because so I've watched Dr. West on television, and I mean, I couldn't disagree with him more. But there have been times where he's made a point, or he's brought up a historical information piece that I didn't know. And so I get informed by that. I don't think he's bringing me over to his side, ideologically, but there's something about having that extra little bit of knowledge that helps me. I'm like, okay, so that's where he's getting this, the thing that's driving him on this issue is partly that history. He's using that to inform what he believes about this or that. It does really help. It actually humanizes the subject and makes it possible to then say, okay, I'd listen to him again. There aren't many people on the left that can say that about, just because
Yeah.
of the stridency, right? And the fact that they're so insulting to having a biblical worldview, because I'm a Christian, and so used to be so mainstream to be a Christian and, like, so bread and butter, and now it's really a point of contention. If you just say, oh, I believe in God, I'm a Christian, it subjects you to attack immediately from some quarters, because they feel like you're some kind of bigot automatically, even though, as you can see, what I don't have to identify, I'm a Black woman. I'm obviously coming from a space in America where I have that history in my family. I'm descended from slaves on one side of my family. So I definitely understand that side as well, but I'm conservative and I'm a Christian. So I think there's a lot of self-censorship. I saw a study, there's been more than one poll, 66% of Americans report self-censorship at their
Yep.
workplace.
I see it with my students, Stacy.
Yeah, yeah.
And by the way,
oh,
in our seminars together, I've noticed something interesting, that Cornell tends to be tougher on left-wing students who are spouting ideology rather than thinking than I am. And I tend to be rougher on the conservative students who are just giving the conservative party line and not really reasoning than he is. And isn't that interesting?
it is. It's something I wish more college students could witness, because what you're doing is you're basically saying, don't just memorize a bunch of things and come into the space so you
Yep.
can beat the opponent down with facts. And, because we love our charts and graphs on the right, but you really have to have an understanding, a nuanced understanding of why the viewpoint is correct. And I can tell you, Professor, what you're doing is so important because there are tons of students out there. Our oldest daughter just graduated from college, and she did not have those opportunities to kind of joust back and forth with viewpoints. Now, she's in the sciences, so she didn't take a lot of classes that, well, the political science classes, things like that. That wasn't a part of her curriculum. But there were places in the scientific arena where debate would have been very fruitful, but there are only certain accepted answers and there is no room for discussion. And so part of that is kind of a comfort because she experienced less woke, interactions. But then on the other hand, in places where there was room for disagreement, it wasn't permitted because there's only one thing that's accepted. And so we need that back in the college arena because I feel that a proper college education at the university level, where you are allowed to challenge and test ideas, better prepares you for the marketplace, because in the corporate world, it is those who challenge and test ideas who then go on to create new products and services and to create these really vibrant companies that the products that we all know and love come from. These products don't come from echo chambers. They come from organizations where there is real disagreement in boardrooms and in spaces where the creativity happens. And we're going to lose that as a country if we can't raise up a generation of people who can argue with each other.
That's absolutely right. In the program that I direct at Princeton called the James Madison Program of American Ideals and Institutions, I founded it in 2000, so we've been going for 22 years. This is what we promote, and we have a motto, and it's a tripartite motto. We tell our students, think deeply, think critically, including self-critically, and think for yourself. And that third one really is the challenge for our young people today, to think for themselves, not allow themselves to be indoctrinated either by individual professors who just try to mainline dogma into their heads, or by the general culture. You need to be able to step back from cultural norms and say, is it right? What's the argument for it? What are the counter arguments? What's the best to be said for and against this idea? Unless we get to there, we're not going to have the kind of creative thinkers that you're right, we all benefit from. I mean, we benefit from it in the humanities and technology and the sciences. We need genuinely creative thinkers, people who can think outside the box. But if you're just indoctrinated, you're the opposite of a creative thinker.
Yeah, there's no room for creativity because it's the challenging of your ideas that causes you to rethink them and either solidify them or adjust them, depending on what the challenge is. And
exactly,
it's such mental energy, and it's a muscle that if it's not worked, it becomes stagnant and we're unable to do that. And so I think the story here of Professor Katz, it's such a sad story, but it should be one of the last ones we hear about, because there should be a widespread backlash against destroying someone for expressing a contrarian viewpoint or for having a mistake in their past that they've paid for. It burns me up to think of him spending an entire year without pay, and then also going through counseling for a consensual relationship that, of course, it broke the rules. So maybe the therapy was good. He was in it for more than 1 year, but to do all of that, he bent over backwards to comply and still lost his job. That is unfairness of an epic level. And I want to see us get away from that.
It's a terrible tragedy. I should add that it means that our university sent away the person who may be its best teacher. His teaching evaluations from students over 23 years were off the charts. It's just a phenomenal teacher as well as being a good scholar. Our loss will be the gain of the American Enterprise Institute, which has hired Professor Katz as a senior research scholar, AEI in Washington, D.C., and he's going to be focusing his work on higher education and higher education reform, especially in the humanities. I hate to see him out of the classroom because, as I say, he is a phenomenal teacher, but his talents are not going to go to waste. And I'm very grateful to the people at the American Enterprise Institute for recognizing that talent and recognizing that it needs to be drawn on for everybody, for the benefit of all of us. So you'll be hearing from Professor Katz in the future, believe me.
Well, maybe I'll get to interview him because we often have scholars from AEI on the program, and
Oh,
it's
good.
always such a pleasure to chat with them because the knowledge base is phenomenal. They're experts of preeminent stature, like yourself. So I was very excited when I saw your name on the calendar today. I was like, oh my goodness, Demetrius, what a great guest! So thank you so much,
Thank you,
Professor Robert
Stacy.
P. George, for joining me today. This is such an important conversation, and I sincerely hope that this new avenue for Professor Katz will allow him the space to start to reverse the tide on some of this, because it's such a shame for the students who come after to not have access to Professor Katz's teaching, to not have him as a professor to guide them as they continue their education. But they do still have you. So thank you so much for joining the show today.
Thank you, Stacy. It's my very great pleasure.
I hope to speak to you again. Until then, happy summer to you. And thank you so much for joining the podcast today. I'm Stacy Washington. You can find out more at stacyontheright.com and familyvisionmedia.org. God bless.